Welcome back to Rounding the Bases Extra Innings. Joel Goldberg, Dr. Chris Jenson. I hope you listen to the audio version of this podcast. It'll be 40 minutes well worth your time. If you got a nice little 40-minute drive or you're chilling out or you want to, do it in, 10 parts of 4 minutes or something like that, wherever your attention span is, I highly recommend it. But let's get to some of the fun stuff. And let me begin with your book, where we talk so much about the workplace and education and the pandemic and career burnout. Your book, which came out in 2021, After the Mask, A Guide to Caring for Students and Schools. Tell me about this.
Sure. It was a passion project. And while we were all going through the thick of the pandemic, perhaps it was a way for me to escape the situation. But I started thinking, what do we do when the virus eventually falls off? And I'm not a stunningly bright guy, but I was smart enough to realize, hey, we've got some student mental health issues. And we also have staff that are exhausted. We see, as we talked about in the podcast, we have burnout in multiple career fields. It's not just a US problem, it's across the world. The world is changing and we're struggling to adapt to it. But I knew that burnout existed heavily in education. We were already seeing the attrition rate spike. And so what it was an opportunity to sit down and methodically, through the lens of a science nerd, how can we use a problem-solving model to examine specific things within the educational world that we can influence, that we have the ability to change, because it's not worth our time focusing on things that we can't impact. But looking at the operations of how students and educators interact in school and using action items that would support mental health, deter career burnout, and walk people through the argument of why they should work.
All right, so check that out on Amazon, wherever you get your books. After the Mask, A Guide to Caring for Students and Schools. We're rounding the bases with 4 final questions with Chris Jenson. The second question, and I like fun ones like this. So you go from the ER, end up in the classroom, award-winning science teacher. I'm curious what's more challenging, a tense moment in the ER, which I know is life and death. I'm not trying to compare that, versus kids, students.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, the acuity or severity of the problem in the emergency department usually far exceeds what's going on in the classroom. But the management, I would say, is a lot harder with students. For one, you don't have brilliant nurses to help you. But no, I mean, it's funny, Joel, because honestly, they're kind of analogous. Nothing goes as planned. There's chaos. You have to reestablish control. You have to have sometimes difficult conversations. You have to try and bring out the best in people, maybe when they're in a suboptimal setting. There was a lot of comparisons that I chuckle at, but at the time were very interesting to stumble upon.
Yeah, I know that ER doctors are kind of wired to, and I know there's some PTSD with this, but you are wired to kind of go home and leave it there, right? I mean, you lose a patient or something, you got to move on to the next one and the next one. I'm guessing you could go home sometimes though from teaching, and some of that stuff would, bad encounter with a kid or a rough moment, that stuff probably lived with you a little bit.
Yeah, it did. It really did, especially because kids, any way you cut it, maybe chronologically they're getting close to being adults in high school.
Yeah.
But I think most educators look at them as this thing that needs to be protected. They're still kids, and you're trying to prepare them for life. And, some of that is your subject matter and teaching them responsibility and planning ahead. But you're rooting for them. You want them to do well. You want all of them to do well. And they all come from different backgrounds and situations, and they're all going to achieve at different levels. But inherently, you want them all to do well. And so I think, just like physicians and nurses and pharmacists become very close to their patients, and though we're taught not to, we sometimes get emotionally attached. You do with your students. And so there's a lot of parallel there, and you want them to succeed. And when it goes the other direction and they're having hardships, I think every quality educator or every quality healthcare provider feels for them. And something you might find this true to be in your line of work, but something that I was taught was, it never gets any easier when you see bad things happen. You just get better at dealing with them, as time goes on and experience is added. But yeah, I think you carry that stuff home, whether you are seeing minor trauma in the classroom or chest tubes in the ER.
Yeah. All right, third question. We got some good research on this. My assistant Ashley, who essentially is the executive producer of this podcast, always throws me some good stuff. So, and I never know where she gets it from. But I understand you had one and only one home run in high school playing baseball, and that it was a memorable one.
Yeah, well, I feel very sheepish talking to a guy who knows professional players, but yeah, it's a good story. So I played
I'm all
high
about the
school. I was a
story, by
line.
the way. There's no comparison. It's all about the story.
Yeah. So I was a line drive hitter, and I loved baseball, and it was, my outlet and my fun. But I was a line drive hitter, not a deep ball guy at all. And my dad parked his brand new car, he was he was a Marine fighter pilot, very practical, never bought new cars, always bought used stuff. But he bought a new car, and he parked it right beyond basically the left field foul pole. And I eked over a home run, and it went through the front passenger window. And it was my one and only home run ever. And and so the ball's inside the car, and it's after the game, and I didn't know I'd done it. I had no idea. And my dad's just sitting there, and we look at each other. I'm like, "Do you want me to sign it?" And we just exploded in laughter. So
All right. Well,
there you go.
glad there was good humor involved in it, and you'll never forget that one. I mean, if you're only gonna have one home run, you either want it to be a walk off or something. If you can't get to the level of Roy Hobbs in The Natural, you might as well send it through your dad's new car. So,
Yeah, it
all right,
was a pretty small career, but it was a fun career.
that's all right. You'll never forget it. Last one, the walk off, and I found this one interesting that you oversaw a study on scholastic gaming, esports, with a study that concluded in June of this past year, and that is something that any of us that have kids, especially boys, but girls too, most people I know, myself included, feel like, "Ah, my son, sometimes he doesn't leave that room for hours, and he is communicating, he is socializing, but it's not the way that we did it." And then, of course, there's all the violence and the this and that. So, without even knowing the answer, I'm just curious what that study brought you, or what you found out, or what your biggest takeaways were.
Yeah, sure. Screen time is a big issue. And at the time this study was formulated, I was one of my talking points or consulting references was discussing with schools the impact of screen time and when it can be helpful and when it has setbacks. And I became interested in a cohort of kids that were really aggressive with online gaming, aggressive in terms of spending a lot of time with it and what were the effects. And there was a lot of theories, and the data at that time, there was decent data, but there wasn't all the things we were hoping for. And so we created a study of what if we could take kids who their big connection is video games and create a class. And so 37 schools, roughly 700 kids participated across the US. And they created a class for academic gaming, and they made it academic in nature. So it wasn't just sit down and playing video games. It was coding, design, website aspects, looking at graphic design that went into the games. There was a lot of academic constructs. But then what we did is we embedded in the lessons principles of self-esteem, self-efficacy, and life skills. And the reason we did that is because the perception and some of the preliminary data was that a lot of kids who gravitate towards video games might have some risk factors where they could benefit from lessons about self-esteem, self-efficacy, resilience, and life skills. And so really this academic course about gaming, the secondary gain, which was deliberate, was trying to support kids' self-esteem, efficacy, and life skills. And we did that deliberately. And then so we used metrics from the field of psychology. People way smarter than me designed some numeric scales that measured self-esteem and self-efficacy. And we tracked these kids over time. We tracked them for a semester. And what we found was the experimental group who got these lessons about self-esteem and self-efficacy, their values improved, suggesting that their state of mental health improved. And the kids who did not get these lessons, flatline, no change. Didn't get worse, didn't get better. Now, by research standards, a couple hundred kids is still a small study. But it's enough that I hope that when we publish it, it'll inspire larger organizations at the university level or whatnot to do a larger study and look into this further, because wouldn't it be great if we had some quantitative data to justify embedding lessons of self-esteem and self-efficacy, not just with kids who play video games, but across
Yeah.
the board, in courses anywhere in school.
Makes so much sense. Interesting, fascinating stuff. All of it has been. Again, I appreciate it, and I want to encourage everybody, remind everybody, check out the audio version of the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Share it. Really, really great, engaging conversation with Dr. Chris Jenson. Chris, thanks again for all your time.
Absolutely, I appreciate sitting down with you.